Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening. I'm Heidi Shoup, President of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., and on behalf of the Board of Directors and members, I welcome you all here this evening and commend you for joining us despite the weather for a discussion of corruption and abuse of power. Our guest speaker is Frank Vogl, founder and president of Vogl Communications, sitting here to my immediate right, and co-founder of Transparency International and Partnership for Transparency Funds. I'd just like to note that he told me earlier this evening that we're almost at the 20th anniversary of Transparency International this evening. His career spans over 4 decades dealing with international economics and financial policy issues as a World Bank official, an advisor to top leaders of international financial institutions, and as a correspondent and initially, years ago, an international reporter. He has been a prominent voice in the area of anti-corruption. His new book, Waging War on Corruption, Inside the Movement Fighting the Abuse of Power, examines the stories of individuals who battle corrupt government, business conspiracies in the name of transparency and justice. You have his biography with you, so I won't go over it again in much detail, but suffice it to say that we look forward to a very interesting presentation, and I thank you for being here with us. Mr. Vogl will be joined in discussion by Philip Dessing, Managing Director of Investigations in the Forensic Practice here at KPMG. He has nearly 30 years' experience working as a special agent in the FBI and as a public accountant. He is a specialist in fraud and misconduct. His work has involved him in investigations of companies across the globe. Mr. Vogl will start out with some remarks, and then Mr. Dessing will join him for a discussion and your questions. During the Q&A period, if you have a question, please come up to the mics here on this side of the room. And with that, I'll introduce Mr. Frank Vogl.
Thank you very much, Heidi. Thank you for those kind remarks. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's really an honor to participate in this foremost foreign affairs forum here in Washington. And no issue pervades foreign policy and foreign affairs more broadly, and perhaps more deeply, than the issue of corruption. It seeps through many aspects of business, defense, finance, public procurement, energy, and natural resources, and national security. I'm focused tonight on corruption in terms of the abuse of government power for personal gain. Corruption takes many forms, but just looking at governmental abuse and who pays government officials under the table is enough for one volume, and that's what my book is concerned about, and that's what I want to focus about this evening. And I want to focus it in 2 parts. First, talking about the journey from the fall of the Berlin Wall through the rise of the Arab Spring, to give you some context of just where we stand today in what I've called in the book title, A War Against Corruption. And then to just deal very briefly, to set up our discussion, with some of the key challenges, looking particularly at business corruption and then security issues, from money laundering and the extractive industries right through to geopolitical strategy. Let me, at the outset, say to you, I could paint for you a complete horror story of how corruption really is really, in a general sense, a crime against humanity, how many millions of people suffer from corruption. Read the book, you'll get chapter and verse. But I want to, at the outset, point out something else. We are winning this war on corruption. And we are winning it because of remarkable heroes, people who lead civil society, and I'll talk more about them a bit later, in very tough countries, from Russia to Sri Lanka, from Venezuela to Zimbabwe. There are people of enormous courage dedicating their lives to fighting corruption. They are making a difference. And as we talk this evening, please always bear in mind that there are these amazing characters, amazing people, amazing friends, who are on the front lines making a real difference in the world we live in. Now, you will say to me, when I said we're winning the war on corruption, you will immediately sit up and sort of say, well, okay, he's saying that, but it doesn't often feel like that, especially when we read the headlines day in, day out. Almost exactly 20 years ago, in February 1993, a small group of friends came together under the leadership of a friend of mine from the World Bank called Peter Eigen, who at that time had just left his job as the bank's representative in East Africa, to create a group called Transparency International. It was the first global anti-corruption non-governmental organization. We did it because we had realized that so many brilliant projects designed for development to lift people out of poverty were being wrecked by theft by government officials who were putting that money not in schools, not in hospitals, not in sanitation, not in decent housing, but in their private Swiss bank accounts. And nobody was saying anything about it. The World Bank refused to discuss it. The United Nations had never addressed the issue. There was almost nobody doing any research, amazingly enough, on this subject. So we decided something had to be done about it, and we benefited from the collapse of the Berlin Wall that liberated thinking about the purposes of development, that made people start looking again about whether development assistance was effective. And from that start, many things happened. When we started out, The Economist magazine depicted us as Don Quixote and Sancho Panza tilting at windmills. And I would say to people, well, we've started a global anti-corruption organization. And they would say to me, how nice. What a good idea. So where have we come in this 20-year journey? Well, first of all, let's talk about civil society. TI started a global movement. And today, Transparency International has 100 national organizations. We have a staff at our headquarters in Berlin of about 150 people. We have tens of thousands of people across the world who are members of our national chapters. 10,000 alone in Bangladesh. Amazing. 20 years ago, there was nothing like that. But much more importantly, there are hundreds of civil society groups today in the world dedicated to anti-corruption. Many of them at the community level, many of them at the national level. One of them, Partnership for Transparency Fund that I've already mentioned, along with Global Witness, along with many specialized organizations, are in the civil society space making an enormous difference. That's just the start. 2 decades ago, the World Bank refused to discuss what they called the C word. Today, not only the World Bank, but all of the development agencies, bilateral, multilateral, consider corruption and good governance to be a priority issue for them. But it's not just there. 20 years ago, there were no international conventions against corruption. Today, there's not only regional conventions, but there's an OECD convention that criminalizes corporate bribe paying to foreign government officials. And there's even, finally, a United Nations Convention Against Corruption that has been signed, ratified by 164 countries. And on the agenda of the G20 summit now, on a regular basis, is review and updating of a so-called G20 action program against corruption. The only action program on a continuous basis that is part of the G20 summit agenda today. So we've come a long way on the formal side. But let's look at other things. 20 years ago, you could have counted on a couple of hands the number of people in academia who were researching corruption. Today, we have 5,000 researchers on the Transparency International Research Network alone. 5,000. We've created a growth industry, at least in research, nothing else. Research has been so important because a tremendous amount of knowledge, a lot of practical knowledge has been generated that provides the toolkits, that provides the roadmaps to making a real difference in the field. And in the field, we've seen amazing public prosecutors, people who've gone after heads of state, gone after top politicians on a scale that today you could say has no precedent and simply did not exist 20 years ago. In Brazil, they have just completed the trial of 30 former top government officials, and a number of them have been sentenced to long prison terms by the Supreme Court. In Peru, Fujimori, the president, is serving a long prison sentence, having been extradited from Chile to Peru, the first time a Latin American country had ever extradited a former head of state to another country. In country after country, and of course here in the US, from Chicago to New York State, we've seen governors or top officials also being prosecuted and sentenced to long prison terms. Never before have public prosecutors been so active. And we see that in a different sense because the amount of investigation that is now being undergone by the US Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission into US corporations and multinational companies that are paying bribes to foreign governments is at an all-time record high. There has never been as much investigation or prosecution as there is today. So the hand of the law is reaching down and making a difference. I could go on with all of these differences, but I want to just make two more points on this 20-year picture. The first is the growth of the internet and of information itself. Without that, we wouldn't have seen this explosion in civil society growth, nor, and maybe more importantly, would we have seen such an incredible increase in public awareness and understanding of what corruption is and what corruption is in their communities, not just worldwide. Through organizations like Global Witness and ProPublica and Global Integrity here in Washington, and a whole series of other specialized investigative journalism organizations, the public across the world, even though governments try to censor it, even though the Chinese at times try to clamp down, the governments around the world, the people around the world, including the Chinese people, are learning more about corruption in their country than ever before. And that leads to the final point. It was beyond our dreams 20 years ago to believe that mass public engagement against corruption would become a reality. And yet today, not just parts of the Arab Spring in Tunisia and Egypt, but from India to Pakistan to Belarus to Iran to Occupy Wall Street, and I could go on and on. Tens of thousands of ordinary people are going into the streets to demand justice, to demand the rule of law, to demand transparency in government, and to demand accountability. This generating of mass public engagement is transforming the landscape of the war on corruption. So where are we today? Well, first of all, I have to agree to all the skeptics that there is always backsliding. You see tremendous progress in a country. You see a wretched, corrupt government official leave, a new government come in declaring it's going to clean it all up, and in 2 years, Kenya, Ukraine, they are back and in many respects worse than the previous one. So yes, there's backsliding. I accept that. Nevertheless, I would say to you, over the last 20 years, we've reached what I would call base camp. It's pretty high. You're out of breath by the time you get there. But at the same time, we still have a full Everest to climb. The challenge ahead of us is formidable. But we put in place the building blocks, whether it's in prosecution, whether it's in media, whether it's in civil society organizations, whether it's in the conventions or the rule of law, we put together those key building blocks from which we can now take on, with greater knowledge, greater confidence, greater energy, the challenges that lie ahead. So let me devote just a few minutes to a few of those challenges. Let me start with business. In my book, I start the chapter on this by saying it all started with Watergate. I came here as a reporter for the Times of London and found myself covering the post-Watergate hearings that were initiated by Stanley Sporkin at the Securities and Exchange Commission and the late Senator Frank Church of Idaho, who ran the subcommittee on multinational corporations. And together, Sporkin and Church played a marvelous game. They built very gradually public interest and media interest. First of all, in corporate malfeasance here at home, as American companies had illicitly financed part of the committee to re-elect the president, Richard Nixon's committee known as CREEP. And then they looked overseas and they found Gulf Oil, they found Exxon, they found a whole series, American Airlines, they found a whole series of corporations that have been paying foreign government officials. And each hearing talked about malfeasance, about corruption, bigger than the hearing before. Until by the time that the head of Gulf was testifying, Frank Church talked bitterly about the cancer of corruption, a phrase that has been used by almost everybody since in giving a speech on corruption, always those people thinking that they've invented it. But Church did it after Watergate. And as he did it, he was joined, and this is really significant, by tremendous support from the right. Today, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce wants to water down the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. They should read the transcripts from the 70s, when a right-winger called William Simon, the former Secretary of Energy and the former Secretary of Treasury, said you cannot have free markets so long as companies are paying bribes like this. We need free enterprise. We need legislation to stop corporate bribery. And you had Senator Percy of Illinois, the former chairman of Bell and Howell Corporation, a Republican from Illinois, who mapped out how destructive corporate foreign bribery was for the whole idea of free enterprise. And then the final day came of the hearings, and Church grilled Dan Houghton, the head of Lockheed, who admitted that Lockheed paid bribes to the Prime Minister of Japan. Headlines, front-page stories, and we'd reached beyond the tipping point, and it wasn't too long thereafter that President Carter signed the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which made it a criminal offense for corporations to pay bribes to foreign government officials. So then the Justice Department started to investigate, and they quickly found out that they couldn't get much evidence because other governments around the world were not willing to cooperate. In Germany, a corporation could not only pay a bribe to a foreign government official, it could deduct it from its taxes. Later, in the mid-90s, and Transparency International was campaigning, but so were many others, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, got enough head of steam to enact the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention that wrote the US FCPA law large. And now, today, 39 countries are party to that. Some are investigating more than others. The amount of enforcement overseas is still far less than anybody could consider to be even serious or desirable. But behind the scenes, there is enormous cooperation between prosecutors overseas and the US Justice Department. And that's why so many more cases are coming. But now we have a dilemma. This is a point for discussion before I go on to a couple of other subjects. Are some companies too large to fine? The New York Times has written extensively about alleged corrupt payments by Walmart in Mexico. Walmart's annual revenues are $444 billion. Its annual profits before taxes are $24.5 billion. What kind of a fine can you impose on Walmart that really would make a difference, that would really change behavior? I think we've reached the point today where we have to get serious beyond the question of cash fines. There have to be serious cases, however difficult they are to make, to prosecute the individuals and companies responsible for the corporate bribery, because there are victims around the world of this bribery. Further, we should follow an example that was set in the UK 2 years ago, when a judge said to British Aerospace Systems, BAE Systems, largest defence contractor in the UK, your £30 million, $50 million fine should not go to the British Treasury, but it should go to build schools in Tanzania, because you have colluded with the government of Tanzania to rob the people of the education they deserve. And the British aid agency was forced by the judge to find a way to put the money into education in Tanzania that bypassed the corrupt government. Maybe we should consider victims when fining corporations. That's just a couple of ideas. But let me expand this finally to the issue and the major challenge, this cluster of issues, of corruption and security. Let's start with the easy one first, money laundering. Global Financial Integrity in Washington, D.C., a specialist in this area, estimates that $1 trillion a year flows illicitly through the global financial system. A small part of that, but still many billions, is related to corruption. You cannot deal with the problem of the euro and Cyprus today if you don't look at what their banks have been doing when it comes to money laundering. You cannot look at the problem of the euro and Greece today if you don't look at tax evasion and corruption in that country. Everybody knows it, but not enough people are being tough about it. And that's the tip of the iceberg, because without money laundering, criminal cartels would be in difficulty, terrorist networks would cease to exist. And so when HSBC, the fourth biggest bank in the world, the biggest bank in Europe, was found as a result of Carl Levin's investigations to have massively aided the Mexican drug cartels to launder money into the United States, the Justice Department decided to fine them $1.9 billion, which against the company the size of HSBC, you have to scratch your head and you have to say, does the punishment really fit the crime? One thing is clear. There is more effort today on the part of the Justice Department and part of financial authorities in this country and abroad to start to do something about money laundering. But it's just a start. We have a long, long way to go in this massive issue. Another issue of security is the extractive industries. The reason why the French have been so protective of the totally corrupt governments of parts of French West Africa is because French oil companies have major contracts with them, and oil is seen as vital to French national security. When TI France decided to go to court with another NGO called Sherpa in France to demand investigations of the assets of the president of Equatorial Guinea and the president of Gabon, the French government came in and opposed it. And when we won the first round, they opposed the appeal. And it went to the Supreme Court in France, and the Supreme Court judges said, to their enormous credit, it's time we cleaned up this mess. And they rejected the appeals of the French government, and there are now a full-scale investigation going on in France of the assets which run into tens of billions of dollars that those leaders have. But there's a broader issue of security when it comes to natural resources. And it is an amazing phenomenon. That's why I say we're winning this war. It's an amazing phenomenon that part of the Dodd-Frank Act that was passed on financial reform includes a section that demands that with effect from 2014, all companies in the United States in the oil, gas, and mining industry that make payments to foreign governments have to reveal those payments in full on an annual basis. This level of transparency, and the European Parliament is going to pass a similar legislation, this kind of transparency will only start, to reveal just the scale of the underground payments to some of the most corrupt regimes in the world. Regimes that sit upon vast natural resources but whose peoples live in terrible poverty. So that's important. How this will play out, especially as the Chinese and the Russians are not playing by the same rules, and want to get natural resources of their own, be it in Sudan or other places like that, makes this a much more complicated security issue. But corruption in natural resources is a security issue, and there is progress. But there is one area where I'm afraid to say I don't have any real answers. Maybe you do, and I look forward to hearing them. And it's the final point I want to make this evening. It is about geopolitical strategy. We US taxpayers are spending every single day $28 million on reconstruction in Afghanistan. Transparency International produces an annual index it's called the Corruption Perception Index. We rank countries to look at which are perceived to be the most corrupt. If you're clean, you get 100 points. If you're almost clean, you're New Zealand, you're Iceland, you're Denmark, and you get 90 points. And if you're perceived to be just a cesspool of corruption, you're right at the bottom. That's North Korea, that's Somalia, with just 8 points each. 8 out of 100. And Afghanistan. It's rock bottom. It's never been there before. The new index puts it rock bottom. And we've poured into that country $100 billion of reconstruction money. Far more than its absorptive capacity. Far more than we could audit. Far more than we can monitor. And the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan admits publicly that there has been massive misuse, massive mismanagement, massive abuse. We did the same in Iraq, and I documented in the book. We've done to a degree the same in Pakistan. We did the same under Mubarak in Egypt. And the question that I can't get my head fully around, but I think is so important, is how do we forge strategic relationships with foreign governments that we see as vital to our security that are totally corrupt? Do we continue to turn a blind eye to their corruption, their theft of our taxpayer money? The question is important because today the citizens of all of the countries that I'm talking about are aware of the corruption. They see us as being part of a conspiracy with their own governments against them. As General Allen said in testimony last March before Congress, this phenomena feeds and fuels the insurgency in Afghanistan. So it's a very tricky question, and there are no simple answers. Let me conclude by just saying to you that I'm optimistic because of the courage of the remarkable people that are leading this fight. When I was doing a section on Fujimori in Peru of the book, I wrote to my colleague Jose Ugaz in Peru, and I said, Jose, you were the original prosecutor of Fujimori. Could you read the section? And by the way, if you like the book, please write an endorsement. And he sent me an email straight back, Frank, I'd love to do it, and he did. But right now, I've got another issue on my mind. They've just found a bomb under my car. So I then wrote to Elena Panfilova in Moscow, terrific woman who's been leading Transparency International for a decade in Moscow. And you talk to Elena, and she did also write a wonderful endorsement of the book, and you talk to her. And one day she was in a shopping mall with her kids buying jeans on a Saturday afternoon, and she got so fed up with these goons who were following her all the time that she went to them, told them to go away, leave her alone. She went back to her office, she pounded out a letter to the Minister of the Interior, but she didn't send it. And 2 days later, somebody from the Ministry of Interior phoned her and said, we hear you've written to complain. Elena does not have to press the send button. And she is under enormous risk right now because on November 21st last, the Russian government passed a new treason law, and a new law that says that all international civil society organizations that get any funding at all from overseas have to declare themselves as foreign agents publicly. And this is a country, after all, where just over 3 years ago, Sergei Magnitsky died in prison. And the US Congress has passed an act to try to underscore that this great and noble corruption fighter should not be forgotten. In Sri Lanka, my friend Willie's office has been bombed several times and he's been kidnapped. And his team of 40 people all have safe homes to go to. But they soldier on. They are people of enormous courage, more and more of them dedicating themselves to this fantastic fight. And so I was impressed in December 2010 when 3 remarkable women won the Nobel Peace Prize. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and Lema Gouabi from Liberia rather, and Tawakkol Karman from Yemen. She's just, by the way, joined our TI Advisory Council. And the richly deserved award for valor in promoting freedom and justice was given to them by the Norwegian Nobel Committee, whose head, Thorbjørn Jagland, concluded his speech in Oslo with a quotation from the American author and civil rights advocate James Baldwin, who said, "The people that once walked in darkness are no longer prepared to do so." Mr. Jagland added, "Make a note of that, all those who wish to be on the right side of history." Thank you.
Well, thank you, Frank. That was very inspiring. One of the things that jumped out at me when I read this book is you pretty much touched on all the points I was going to make. But the one thing that jumps out at me is the comment that corruption is a crime against humanity. In our country, prosecutors and to a certain degree investigators view corruption as a white-collar crime. And unfortunately, in some cases, the sentencing guidelines associated with those crimes kind of view that as not really a bad thing. White-collar criminals tend to get more probation than... So could you elaborate a little bit more and maybe discuss what could the various prosecutors and court systems do?
We had a long debate at an annual meeting of Transparency International about whether corruption is a crime against humanity. And of course, it was pointed out that that has a very particular legal definition with regard to the International Criminal Court. And my friends from Bosnia-Herzegovina argued you cannot compare the deprivation and the victimization from corruption to ethnic cleansing and genocide. And we should not legally, therefore, try to make this part of the ICC agenda. And I fully accept it. But in a broader sense, I think the time has come where there has to be much more focus on the victims, to answer your question. Okay. Pietronella knows so well from her travels over years in Africa, just to give you one example, or Michael Matthews sitting back there from his travels in Latin America. How many times one has seen people living in horrendous poverty, even though officially the government budgets are there for the schools, the clinics, the sanitation, the roads, and all the rest of it, but they never get built. These are the victims. Too often, particularly in this country, I think, more so I'd say here than almost anywhere else, prosecutions under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and you know much more about this than I do, and you maybe should explain to the audience more about it, never mention the victims. It's as if these are victimless crimes. Walmart is alleged to have done massive bribery in Mexico in order to get permits to build new shops, new stores in all sorts of places, you know, historic landmarks, places that are already over-congested, places where the environment is terrible. Clearly, they're going to add to, in one form or another, to further decay of the environments in which they operate. And there are people who live there, people who will suffer from that. But they never get mentioned. They didn't even get mentioned in the 5 pages of the New York Times story. So I would argue you've got to start, as you do in all normal criminal law, with discussing the victims. The idea that you would put a murderer on trial and not mention who was murdered is absurd. And yet we put corporations on trial effectively and never talk about the victims. So I think that's the starting point.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, you mentioned Walmart. I'm prohibited from discussing the Walmart case. So let's go from a historical perspective and talk about the Siemens investigation specifically and the settlement associated with that, which was in the neighborhood of $1.6 billion.
The Siemens case was absolutely remarkable. Here, a company, and we're talking about the largest electronics company in Europe, the second largest in the world. Here was a company where, as I understand the case, at the very top of the company, they developed a very sophisticated strategy of how to pay bribes in many countries as part of their business plan, and how to use offshore island bank accounts, dummy bank accounts, and all the rest of it in order to hide the payments. Maybe you'd like to explain a bit more about it. I mean, you look at that and you say, this is just crazy. And the trouble was that they got prosecuted. The major prosecution was here in the United States and to some extent in Germany. But they have been fighting many of the cases that have been brought against them in other countries, which are still tied up in the courts, even though they've essentially admitted guilt here in the U.S.
Yeah.
Maybe.
And we were talking before the program. I was an FBI agent who investigated international corruption matters the last few years of my career, and was the case agent on the Siemens case. And I remember sitting there just thinking when he talked about what they had found, I just turned to the attorney, Mark Mendelson, who was running the department at that time, and I said, somebody needs to go to jail. Somebody needs to go to jail. And people pay bribes, not companies. And so, you know, that's been a debate and with the Department of Justice and Security and Exchange Commission to a certain degree, and it's been in the press around in Washington, D.C. especially, about where do you focus your resources, because it's all about resource driven. I mean, you know, in law enforcement and regulatory matters, prevention is resource driven. And so do we dedicate the resources or we don't? And you know, when the FCPA was passed in 1977, the 1980s, we just didn't hear a lot of cases. And I was going to ask you about that. What do you think happened? And
well, the big thing that happened was that it was so hard to get evidence. And in the 1980s, many American companies tried to lobby the Reagan administration to get the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act actually turned back. And they failed. And having failed, they sort of wondered, well, what's their next strategy? And they said, well, look, if we can't roll back our law, let's make sure that everybody else has the same law so we have a level playing field around the world. And when Warren Christopher, as Secretary of State in the Clinton administration, a corporate lawyer who knew a lot about these arguments, took office as Secretary of State, he initiated the U.S. effort, strongly supported by General Electric and many other U.S. companies, to try to get an OECD law passed. And TI were very early on board in trying to get civil society, particularly in Europe, to lobby for this. And the amazing thing, the little footnote on all this, is that we got leaders of German industry to write to the German government saying they supported the law, this new anti-corruption law, including the head of Siemens, who stayed on and was running this conspiracy. Embarrassing, but
he happened to be a U.S. citizen, and he came from HP. I think he was the CEO of HP, and he was transferred over. So, but you know, so that's our connection with the Siemens case. He is absolutely right. It was the most systemic corruption developed by senior executives in every country they operated in. And it was, these payment systems were developed and passed down from one executive to another executive. And it was a very close inner circle, a group of people. And it was primarily German nationals. So it was a very interesting case to be a part of. They have settled the corporate case. There are 8 individuals, including the first board member ever be charged under the FCPA, so have been indicted, and so they'll eventually be tried in the U.S. You actually said in your book, and I'm going to quote if you don't mind, the single most important development in changing the anti-corruption landscape was the post-events of Watergate. So let me understand this, you're an investigative reporter in the 1980s in Washington, D.C. 70s, excuse me. And the president gets impeached, and then you have these hearings done by 2 courageous individuals. Right. That had to be a blast. I mean, a whirlwind.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think for Americans, anything that came after Watergate per se was sort of anticlimactic. It was amazing, however, what the reaction was in Japan when it came out that Prime Minister Tanaka had been accepting bribes. I've never seen as many Japanese journalists, including in Tokyo, as I saw in Washington the day that the Church Committee held those hearings, because everybody had been tipped off that there was some big scandal for Japan that was coming. What is quite shocking, though, if I may fast forward from this, is that you get these stories, you get these scandals, and then, in many cases, nothing happens. I don't know if any of you looked at the story of what has recently happened at Olympus in Japan and the malfeasance that went on there. But you ask yourself, you know, have they ever learned? The Japanese government has signed the OECD Pact. They have never brought a single prosecution of a Japanese company. So you ask, you know, how can we get other major industrial powers to do this? Significantly, the last country to sign the OECD Pact just last year was Russia. And you have to wonder if they're really going to enforce. But why they did it for all sorts of diplomatic reasons. So we are still, as I said, we've reached base camp. We've got big challenges ahead. But mostly those challenges relate to enforcement. We know what has to be done. We just can't get the political will in many places, in governments, to do what they've said they've done. The United Nations Convention is an amazing document. It covers everything, including political party financing. 164 countries have signed, ratified. Hardly any of them so far have implemented. One of the holdouts is Germany. And you talk to German government officials about why have they held out, not signed this thing. And they say because we have to examine fully whether we can implement. And before, we do not want to sign a document we can't implement. Most other countries just went ahead and signed. Okay. So we have a real gap here.
So, so that's the first significant step. What would you say was the second biggest thing that occurred? Was it the fall of communism?
Well, I think that happened, yes. I mean, that opened the gates to looking at things, as I mentioned in my talk. But I think beyond that, you cannot, I mean, we're several generations here in this room. Younger people in this room cannot imagine what life was like before the internet. When we created Transparency International in 1993, we had to fax out one by one our little press release announcing this to all the people we had on our various mailing lists. And about a week later, you would get a fax back from somebody. It was terribly laborious. It was so hard to think of organizing a global network. We had no money. So how could we pay to have board meetings with board members in 10 different countries if we had to use the regular telephone? There's no Skype. And then came the internet. And this enabled all manner of organizations to do two things: to organize and to secure transparency. Okay. And I think and I think Bill Clinton was absolutely right some years ago when he said that there were two revolutions in the 90s that changed the world. One was the internet revolution, and the other was the civil society revolution. Because in both areas, the degree to which you've seen change has been spectacular. And we, in this particular anti-corruption cause, we have benefited along with the environmental cause and human rights and many others.
Okay. You compared the Arab Spring, well, you said the Occupy Wall Street protests in 2011 were compared, you compared them in the book to the events of the Arab Spring. How were they similar?
Well, people who were involved in Occupy Wall Street, and you could actually read it on their website, mentioned how they were inspired by the Arab Spring. That they felt that there was a way in which very ordinary people could somehow register a protest and perhaps make a difference in the face of enormously powerful institutions. What I consider so seminal and so important, however, about the Arab Spring itself and the enormous courage of people in Tunisia and Egypt to start with, and then in other countries, to go out in the streets and face the risk of being killed by security forces, and many died. What I find so remarkable about that is understanding why they did it. And when you talk to more and more people who were involved, two words keep on coming through. One is dignity, and the other is self-respect. The daily grind of a poor person who has to pay a bribe to a policeman, who has to pay a bribe to see that her or his child can get into school, or pay a nurse to get the most minimum health care, is degrading. It's humiliating. It robs them of their dignity. It robs them of their self-respect. And so in a way, this word, even corruption, is a very technical word, because we are talking about the very existence, what is important in human dignity to people. And this is what erupted in the Arab Spring. And in many ways, people who went into Occupy Wall Street, many of whom didn't have much clue about how the financial system may have worked, they felt in a way that they were being somehow or other exploited in the worst kind of way in a country that suddenly was seeing huge unemployment by major financial institutions they didn't understand but seemed awfully powerful. So it is this sense of exploitation, it is the sense of loss of self-respect and dignity that I think is fundamental to all of this.
What responsibility would you say that corporate America, transnational businesses, what responsibility do they have to the fight for global corruption, against global corruption?
I don't know if you all heard that. It was about what is the responsibility that corporations have to fight transnational corruption. I spent nearly 10 years on the board of a group called the Ethics Resource Center here in Washington, which brings together the chief ethics officers of major corporations. And they are all of the view, which I share, that we are talking here, and to answer your question, we're talking about going beyond compliance.
Okay.
Unfortunately, so many of the issues that we're talking about are taken over by the legal community and turned into an issue that is solely compliance-driven. Are you in compliance with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act? Do you run training programs to see you're in compliance? Well, above compliance comes ethics. Are your values in place? Have you got the right values? Is your corporation imbued with the right values, the right culture? And on the board meeting many years ago of the ERC, the Ethics Resource Center, I happened to mention corruption in Bangladesh. And the chairman of the board, Ray Gilmartin, the head of Merck, the CEO, chairman of Merck Corporation at the time, banged the table with his fist. And he said, we won't do any business in that country because we cannot deploy our values as a corporation in doing the kind of business we want to do there. I haven't heard many CEOs since say something like that, but it's time that they stood out and talked about their values and not just about compliance. And the amazing thing that's happening in many financial services firms today is that there is the start, 5 years after the financial crisis, but nevertheless the start of talking at the board level about changing the culture of the institutions. And that's part of this values debate. And we need a much bigger values debate because compliance training alone is not going to do it, I think.
The OECD published some good practice guidance, guidelines for lawyers and companies and consultants to read on what should be installed into a compliance program. I think, I agree with you on this, the comment of ethics. I think that that's primarily being communicated through the tone from the top. That the top man, basically they say that it starts at the tone from the top. If your managers are if you say no to something that's illegal or something that's inappropriate, and your managers are going to back you, and then the managers' managers will back them, and then the CEO will back the managers, then that's a starting point.
Yeah, but I think it's much harder to do than to talk about. You can go to many corporations and talk to them about this stuff, and they will say, yes, absolutely, the tone of the top is crucial. But just look at HSBC. They paid $1.9 billion in fines. And then they announced that they were going to change their ways and introduce a program around the world to implement Know Your Customer regulation. Now, for anybody who doesn't know, every single bank under the regulations of all of the major industrial countries, every bank through its regulator has to fill out forms that demonstrate that they know their customer. They know where the customer got the money from that they are putting on deposit. We've had that for many years. HSBC announces, big revelation, we are going to start a new Know Your Customer program after they got caught helping the Mexican drug cartel. This is a terrific group. I know because with a different hat on, I've actually worked for the CEOs of HSBC. These are people who will tell you all about tone at the top, that they preach good ethics in their company, but they let this happen. And their reaction publicly was not to issue a press release saying, we did wrong, we mea culpa, we certainly did wrong, we have to clean our act, we have to change, and all the rest of it. No, they issue a press release saying, we are now instituting a Know Your Customer program. So I think they have to walk the talk. Okay. And just talking about the tone at the top just isn't enough. And I think many people are getting fed up with the rhetoric that isn't backed up by the talk. And in many cases, this has to do with incentives, and it has to do with pay and compensation. And I think that's a very big issue, and maybe we should get some questions from our audience.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
You've done a lot to expose corruption around the world, and the organizations you work with and the journalists have been courageous, but there are a couple organizations that have a lot of information about corruption in various countries, and a lot of data about the finances of prime ministers and corrupt ministers. It's the State Department and the U.S. intelligence agencies. I don't condone what Bradley Manning did and what Julian Assange has done, but WikiLeaks exposed a lot of corruption around the world that U.S. embassies know about. Were you surprised by any of the revelations in those cables? And should the U.S. government be doing more to make public what they know privately about the huge bribes that the people they work with are getting?
I don't know if you want to answer that question.
No, please, go ahead. Thank you.
Well, I haven't read all the cables, so I can't comment about that. There are 2 points I'd make, if I may, and excuse me looking this way. Technology. There is a website called IPaidAbribe.com that gets over 1 million hits a year. It's an Indian website, and there are many like it, where people are just going online and registering their complaints because they've been hit up. Transparency International has 76 national advocacy and legal advice centers, so-called ALACs, where people come in and mostly through the internet report abuse, and where other people come in and volunteer to help them, lawyers, auditors, and so on. It's an amazing thing. It's involving thousands of people. A few weeks ago, we had a so-called hackathon of 200 people around the world, all IT specialists, who were working together to create new apps for the telephone and for the iPad, where people could report corruption and monitor corruption. So technology is really here. But to your main point, the Swiss government closed Mubarak's bank account after he was deposed. They closed Ben Ali's Tunisian bank account after he had fled the country. We know that governments know where the money is. The British know what goes on in Jersey to avoid paying taxes by all sorts of people. Everybody knows that a little bit of know your customer research into some of these oligarchs who are buying up huge prime real estate in London and New York and Paris would raise some questions. As I said earlier, we know what needs to be done. We also know where the information is. But we don't yet have the will of the governments and the government authorities to do anything about it and use that information. And finally, in that regard, the recent case that was brought against Standard Chartered Bank for enabling Iran to deposit huge sums of money in the United States is a very important breakthrough. because it's the fifth bank to be prosecuted for that by the US authorities. And it is starting to warn all other governments that there are certain countries, in this case Iran, where the US will not tolerate the lack of action. And I think that's a good sign, but it's just a small fraction of what needs to be done. Great question.
Thank you. My name is Chris Ellison, and I'm a research assistant at Tufts Fletcher School and at the Harvard Kennedy School. And my question concerns culture. In a recent book that came out a few years ago, Lawrence Harrison observed that of the top 10 countries that are cleanest on the TI index, on the CPI, 9 out of 10 of them are historically Protestant, and 1 is Singapore, which is also historically a British colony. And I'd like to get your thoughts on how different, as you move down the list, different groups, you tend to find many countries that belong to a similar cluster. And I'd appreciate your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that's a great question for Harvard and Tufts. And I look forward to the research on it. And I say that a bit facetiously because I don't know the research enough. I do know from some things that friends of mine have said. When we started TI exactly 20 years ago, we had a meeting. Actually, in May, we signed the letters of incorporation in February of 1993. We had a launch meeting 2 months later. And at that launch meeting, General Obasanjo of Nigeria, who a year later was to find himself in prison for having criticized the Abacha government over corruption, said, we need an organization like TI because our children have to grow up believing that somebody could do something about corruption. We cannot have a country where all the politicians go into politics to get rich. My colleague Jeo Sung Kim in South Korea, who created Transparency South Korea, and who had been in prison because he was a human rights activist 30 years ago in Korea, and beaten many times, launched in TI Korea a youth program. He believed that you had to start in the schools to teach values and to talk about governance, talk about politics, and talk about corruption. And if you started in the schools, you could start to have an impact. And there are more and more of these school projects. And I don't think this is a question of religion. I think it's many factors involved. But I do think that those two comments symbolize for me what Obasanjo said and what Jeo Sung say, that we do need to make a bigger effort in our education systems everywhere to talk about values, to talk about good ethics, and to demonstrate that you can have a world with less corruption, that this is a war worth fighting and a war that we can win. Thank you for that. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.